Hi everyone, today we have a very special guest. My mum has very kindly agreed to do a little interview with me, and this way you can practice your listening skills, maybe learn some new vocabulary, and also perhaps learn a bit more about Australia, because Mum has travelled a lot more around Australia than I have.
And a long time ago.
Yes, when things were quite different. Okay, so you grew up in Sydney. You were born and bred in Sydney.
I was.
And then when you were in your 20s, you decided to go on a little trip.
Yes, a little trip that turned into a very long trip.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and I think it was before I got back to Sydney, it was 10, 12 years.
Oh, it was that long?
It was that long.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
And it was in the 60s, right?
It was in the 60s, yeah.
You can do the math for her age.
Yeah.
She looks very good. Hopefully,
Aren't you lucky?
Hopefully it's in the genes. But back then it was quite a big deal as well, right?
Oh yes, it was.
Go across the country.
I think when you're young, you don't think it's a big deal. You just think, oh well, we'll book the train, we'll book the bus, whatever, pack our stuff, and we'll go. Mm-hmm. But it was a bit of a big deal, and we had to. And you didn't say to yourself, okay, when I get to Perth, we'll just go out and buy all new stuff like new saucepans and new towels and sheets. No, you didn't do that. You took it all with you. Mm-hmm. And fortunately, my girlfriend and I had 2 trunks, and we packed all that sort of thing into the trunks, and we had a couple of suitcases. Mm-hmm.
You had suitcases. I was joking with Mum before about this. I said, oh, you had trunks, so you didn't have suitcases yet.
We had suitcases. They just weren't on wheels. They didn't have wheels. You had to carry them. It was those sort of suitcases.
Yeah.
Some people still have them. Mm-hmm. But it's hard going when you have to carry your suitcases. Mm-hmm. Yes, so we left Sydney on a bus. I think we left on a bus.
You went on a bus? Yeah, because I thought you did the whole thing by train.
No. We went by bus.
That would have been so long.
Yeah, it was. From Sydney to Perth it's a long way. And we had to go via Melbourne, and then we intended to stay in Adelaide for a while. So we got that far, and that was all by bus. And then from after we'd stayed in Adelaide for a while, we went on to Perth by train. Mm-hmm. So that was easier because we were on the train for I think 3 nights. Mm-hmm. It's quite a distance across the Nullarbor. Mm-hmm.
And what did you do in Adelaide? In
Adelaide, the first thing, I don't remember how we got the hotel, but we ended up staying in a cheapish hotel. And to save on money, we opened the trunk and got our little heater out. We had a little 2-bar heater. We stood it on its back so that the bars were facing up, and we cooked our toast on there, hoping that no one could smell it, because we weren't supposed to cook in the room. And that was, we have things to put on there for breakfast.
And that way you didn't have to pay for breakfast?
That way we didn't have to pay. In those days they didn't actually, I don't think they gave you breakfast free in the hotel. I don't think they did. So that was, so we could save a bit of money.
The type of thing I would have done in my 20s too.
Yeah. But the main reason we left Adelaide is it wasn't easy to get jobs, but we managed to get jobs waitressing in a restaurant. It was a newly opened Italian restaurant. The trouble was it was so far away, we didn't have a car. We had to get a taxi there and a taxi back again. And by the end of the week, we had hardly any money left. Mm. So that didn't last very long. We didn't stay in those jobs very long. And then we took the train. We booked the Indian Pacific, which now you could get it all the way across. In those days, I think we could only pick it up in Adelaide. Mm-hmm. And we went from Adelaide to Perth.
And what was the story with the puppy?
Oh, we were so young and stupid. We fell in love with this lovely little puppy. Oh, we can't leave it. He will have to take it with us. I don't know how we ended up. I don't even know how we got it in the first place, but we took the puppy on the train with us. So we had to keep it hidden in our compartment, and we had to put newspaper all over the floor. So if it did something, we could get rid of that and put some more newspaper down.
You weren't hoping that it would hold on.
No, we weren't hoping that it could hold on for 3 days. So that was one of the sillier things that we did. And then crossing the Nullarbor, it's basically desert for about, what did I say, about
3 days.
3 days, and it's about it was about 500 miles, so that would have been,
about 800, 900
kilometres, something like that. And so at night, when you went to bed, you'd close your curtain, but when you looked out the window,
it's basically the same.
It was the same as when you got up in the morning. There was no difference.
It's travelling long distances in Australia.
They call it desert, but it wasn't sand dunes like you imagine the Sahara. It was just like rock and a few bushes, and you hardly ever saw an animal. Except for one morning when we got up, raised the blind, getting dressed. Well, there's no reason not to raise the blind. There's no one out there, so we thought. And in the middle of getting dressed, when we had our underwear on, the train slowed down and there was some workmen standing out there. And we thought, oh, no, close the blind very quickly.
I'm sure you made their day.
I'm sure we did.
Or their week.
I wonder how many other people had their blinds open. Yeah. So we eventually got to Perth, and I found a job in a bar. That was easy for me because bar work you can pick up and drop, and my friend found a secretarial job after about a week, and we stayed there I was there off and on for about 3 years or more.
Off and on because you went.
Because I went north. I went up to Derby and worked there, which was there's a very good expression. A one-horse town. Well, this was a 2-pub town. Oh, it's even bigger than a one-horse town.
Wow.
We worked in one. I was with another friend at that stage. We worked in one pub, and the only place to go when you had time off was to the other pub. There was nothing else. But if there was a party, I remember somebody who worked at a bank had their 21st birthday party. So they just simply made an announcement. Hey, we're having a party. Come on over. Everybody who wanted to go went. It was really good.
You said you got paid well there.
Sorry. Got paid well. And everything was covered.
Because there was nothing to do.
No, they had to give you accommodation in places like that, and they have to feed you. And we had a cook that, she had a bit of a temper, and sometimes people in the dining room would say, "Oh, could you ask the cook to make me a medium rare steak?" And the cook, in a very loud voice, say, "The steak will come anywhere, cook it."
You said there were quite a few interesting characters.
There were interesting.
In those small towns.
Oh, there were. There was, and I was there in October. Let me see, September, October, November. And in November was what they called suicide month.
Oh.
Because of the conditions, the weather conditions, and you find a lot of men go there to work, do mine work and work on oil rigs and things like that. And it can be very lonely at times for people like that. And sometimes they just, as the expression goes, go bush. They just wander off into the bush, and someone had to go look for them. And they did. I can remember one fellow that wandered off into the bush. And I think they found him about 3 days later, and he was still alive. They brought him back to town. He said, "The police found me after 1 day and had me tied to a tree for 2." I knew the plan. I don't think they do things like that.
Well, with the weather conditions, is it because it was the rainy season, so it was grey and hot?
Well, it was what that time of the year is what they call it the buildup to the rainy season. So almost every day, it was very humid, very hot and humid. Then every afternoon you get grey clouds, black, and then they'd be turned to black, and you'd get thunder and lightning, and you wouldn't get any rain. You just get thunder and lightning, and it was really oppressive. And that would happen day after day after day until eventually it rained.
Okay. And then you said you went to the Northern Territory. Then
we went to the Northern Territory.
And getting there was a bit tricky.
I was actually working with another girlfriend, and she had a boyfriend that worked on an oil rig. And she had moved to Derby because he was on an oil rig that was just outside Derby. By the time she got there, they'd moved him onto another oil rig. So she stayed there for, 6 months, and then she followed him to another place. And by the time she got there, they'd moved him to another oil rig. Eventually, she caught up with him in Darwin. But it just happens in places like that. You don't have much control over it. Yeah.
And you had to drive to Darwin? It means to get into Northern Territory, there weren't any buses or trains?
No, by that time I'd gone back to Perth, and then from Perth we drove. And that was, and there were places where, once again, there's no sealed roads, for hundreds of kilometres there's no sealed roads. And places where there were just what they call it bull dust. It looks like sand, but it's reddish colour, and it's actually dust. And there was one patch where it's
not compacted.
No, it's not. And they say I think there was about 80 kilometres of it. And they said, whatever you do when you're driving across it, don't stop. Because if you stop, you might not get going again. You might end up buried in the sand. So there were times when it was difficult. There was, and then, there's a lot of feral camels out in the west.
Yeah. We have a lot of camels in Australia.
Believe it or not.
More than 1 million feral camels.
Yep.
So wild camels.
Yeah. Not very nice sometimes, It can be a little bit frightening, if you're surrounded by feral camels. They were brought to Australia in the 19th century. 19th century, yeah, 19th century. A lot of Afghanis came to Australia. They brought camels with them, and they worked as they were traders, and they did a lot of work in outback Australia. That there were no roads, there was no railway, and goods need to be taken from one place to another. Mail had to be delivered. They did all those sort of things, but the camels, from time to time, they'd lose a camel. Here and there, there'd be a camel gone. Yeah. And that eventually built up until we now have over 1 million camels in Australia. And they actually now get exported to Saudi. Yeah, so it's for breeding stock and for meat, camel meat. But it's interesting that there's so many of them out there. And I'll tell you, the one place I met a so-called friendly camel was a small place. As I said, you had to wait. You had to be very careful with your petrol. You'd fill up your car with petrol, and then you'd have to know how far away was the next place you could fill up with petrol. Because if anything went wrong, you could be stuck out there
for days.
Well, actually, usually somebody came by, but you hope that they had extra petrol if you didn't have it. And one thing in those days, if you did stop on the side of the road for any reason, somebody coming by would stop to see if you were okay. Yeah. Do you have a problem? Have you out of water? Have you got a flat tyre? At one point we had a flat tyre, and we had to sit with the car. The flat tyre was on the caravan, and we didn't have for some unknown reason, we didn't have a spare for the caravan, a spare tyre. And so somebody had to take our tyre into the next town, get it fixed and bring it back to us. And we sat there for half a day and half a night till the very nice people came back with the tyre.
No, you have to make sure you had enough water, right?
Yeah,
when you travel through the desert, you need.
You need to
even in cars, you need a lot of.
You have to make sure you have plenty of water. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But I was going to tell you about the place that had the camel. It was one of these petrol stops, that people would have to stop and fill up petrol there. Mm-hmm. And there was just a pub, so a place where you could go and drink and eat. And outside they had a petrol bowser.
One pump. Yeah.
One pump. And they also had a camel.
Was it tied up?
I don't know. Don't think it lay. I just think it just hung around. Uh-huh. I think it got fed there, and also it liked beer. And people would just come out, leave a can of beers on the side, and he'd pick it up in his mouth. He'd rip out the pull top of the beer, drink the beer, and spit the can out.
He'd become very Australian.
Yes, he was very Australian. A very Australian camel. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so from that was travelling up the coast and then into Northern Territory and to the Ord River, which was one of the Ord River is in a place called Kununurra, and they have a dam there, and it's I've been in some hot places, but this is one of the hottest places I've ever been in.
Humid as well.
And there was no air conditioning anywhere. Like you could go in, you went into one of the pubs there, no air conditioning. There might be fans, but it was just hot.
Mm-hmm. Was it humid or was it a dry heat?
I think it was both.
Depend on the day.
It was just hot. Yeah, so that was Kununurra, and then on up to Darwin, and it's interesting in Darwin too, because they're more like it's very tropical, Darwin. So they have they basically only had the two seasons, the wet season and the dry season. That's basically what they have, wet and dry.
And what was Darwin like back in the 60s?
It was like the Wild West.
Really?
And they said it had one of the largest floating populations of anywhere in Australia.
Floating meaning people moved
transient
around
that people just came in and out, and so the post office was very busy because a lot of people's address was the post office. And so a lot of people then they had all these boxes where people's mail was kept, and you just go in and collect your mail from there.
You weren't there during
Cyclone Tracy. No, I'd left about I think 6 months before Tracy hit. It was Christmas Eve.
Yeah.
I don't remember the year, but it was Christmas Eve, and it really hit. It was a direct hit.
A really bad cyclone.
Yeah, really bad. Darwin. Yeah. A cyclone, what we call a cyclone, is what they call hurricanes in the US. But it really destroyed the place. And, yeah.
And then you eventually went back to Sydney.
And eventually got back to Sydney. Yes. So it wasn't a little trip after all.
Yeah. Okay, Mum, well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
For joining me in this video. Maybe we'll do it again.
We might find something else to talk about.
Thanks very much for watching, guys. If you have any questions, just put them in the comments, and I'll see you soon. Bye. Okay. Yeah, and just be careful you don't kick that, because
I'm trying not to.
Otherwise it might shake.